Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Today we, as you can see, have a new bookshelf. So I just moved into a different room in my house and we added a bookshelf in the back. So now it is full back here and we have it cornered, which I've been absolutely loving. And I also have my desk beside me here. So it just makes filming a lot easier. I'm not gonna actually be sitting in my reading chair. I just have my desk chair here. I'm not moving furniture around every time I have to film, so that is great. But today we're going to be talking about low spice book recommendations. These are all going to be fantasy, romance, dystopian books. And these are books that I would recommend to literally anybody on the street. These are just good books that still have an amazing romance plot, just without all of the open door spice. So these will all be closed door, more YA and upper YA recommendations that everybody can enjoy. Do not let the YA steer you away from these books because truly they are not written in a way that is very middle grade. The plot and yearning and banter and tension and everything is just so good in these books, and they have a lot of things that some adult romantasy just really miss the mark on. Starting off strong, we have Throne of Glass. This has officially been switched over to an adult classification, but it was originally published as a YA series. So there is not going to be a bunch of open door spy scenes. There's a few that are like kind of fade to black and go a little bit more in depth later on in the series, but this is an 8-book series and oh my gosh, is it a wild ride. I would say this is probably my favorite series of all time, and I have a very specific reading order for this series. I'm going to be doing a full Sarah J. Maas breakdown video eventually. So that is where I'll talk about my series order, but this is Throne of Glass, which is the first book in the series. There's a prequel that comes before this as well. And this is essentially about an assassin who gets put into these trials to be the king's champion and basically his like personal assassin to do his dirty work. And she's competing against all of these other criminals and jewel thieves and scary people. This is one of the most complex, amazing series that I have ever read, and it doesn't start out that way, which is why it's so good. It just very slowly brings you into the world, so it's not confusing. But by the time you're on the last book, which is Kingdom of Ash, you are literally jaw-dropped, like, how did we get here from this first book? It is insane. Infinite stars for this series, and if you have people who enjoy Game of Thrones, who enjoy Hunger Games, who enjoy book series like that, I think people will like this, but truly there's nothing you can compare it to because it is its own thing. The next series we have is the Caraval trilogy. This is basically about a magical carnival, and if you win the carnival at the end, there is a wish that's gifted to you by the ringmaster, and it follows two sisters, Scarlett and Donatella, through this journey, and they truly are just some solid great reads. You really get immersed in this world and it feels very fun and lighthearted, and then even when it does get a little bit darker. But then after this series, you go into the spin-off series. This is actually book 2 in the spin-off series, which is the Once Upon a Broken Heart series, and it takes one of the characters from the original Caraval trilogy and basically gives him his own trilogy. So this is The Ballad of Never After. I think this is my favorite book that Stephanie Garber's ever written out of all 3 Caraval and all 3 Once Upon a Broken Heart books, but it follows Jax, the Prince of Hearts, who you will meet in Caraval, and I definitely suggest reading Caraval first, although you don't have to. Reading this after Caraval makes it such a better reading experience, and this series definitely gets a little bit darker in themes, but it's still not anything jaw-dropping that you would need to worry about. It's all very fun and lighthearted. The next series that I like to recommend is Assistant to the Villain. I recently read this. This is an adult classified book, but there really is zero, and I mean zero. We don't kiss, nothing in this book, but the romance is still there and the banter and tension's been building for 2 books, and book 3 comes out in September. This series is essentially a fantasy rom-com, and the villain is absolutely hilarious and basically has this girl who becomes his assistant, and it's just a very like poking fun at her boss situation. And he's of course secretly in love with her, because we wouldn't have it any other way. This is a good one to step into if you enjoyed TV series like Once Upon a Time or My Lady Jane. It really gives classic modern take on a fairy tale story. Next, we have the Powerless series by Lauren Roberts. This is about a world where you have powers, and if you have powers, you're one of the elite, but if you don't have powers, then you're marked as ordinary. And basically the kingdom and the higher ups have decided that they need to get rid of all of the people that don't have powers and almost like purify the bloodline. So anyone who is found to not have a power is executed. And our main girl Peyton, of course, powerless, does not have a power. And she ends up getting put into these trials that they do every year with a bunch of the powerful people. It's very similar to the Hunger Games in that aspect. Gets caught up between two brothers. One of the brothers is actually the enforcer who goes and executes the people who don't have powers, and so she has to fool all of them that she does have powers the entire time. And honestly, it's just super fast-paced and a really, really fun story. The last book in this series is also coming out this year, so it's a great time to start right now. This next series I have is one that nobody really talks about a lot. It is the First Life series. And this is more of a dystopian based than fantasy based, and essentially it's about this girl Tenley, and everybody in this world has their first life and their second life. And so in your first life you basically commit to one of the two afterlives. So you get to go to Myriad or Troika, and you have people who are trying to convince you to pick either or the whole time, and she gets caught up in another little love triangle. We love love triangles in these books. They're kind of fun. But it is just a very, very cool, unique series. I haven't read anything else like it, and this is a completed trilogy, so all 3 books are out. I actually haven't read the 3rd one yet, but I've read the 1st and 2nd one twice. I read them in high school, and then I read them last year as well. And they were just as good the second time I read them, so definitely give this one a shot. It is very, very cool. I would say the vibes are gonna go more so on like the Allegiant Maze Runner side of things and less on the fantasy side of things. The next book I have is Divine Rivals. So this is a completed duology, and I'm not even gonna lie to you guys, I wasn't the biggest fan of this book, and I haven't read the 2nd one yet, but I definitely think that's just my personal preference thing, and I know there are so many people who love this, and I still do like recommending this book to people, especially if I am starting to learn their reading taste. This is going to err more on the side of a historical fiction and less on the side of a fantasy. There's very few fantasy aspects throughout it, but it is very beautifully written. The way that Rebecca Ross writes is just very pretty, and you really get emotionally invested in these 2 characters, and it is a very sweet, wholesome love story in this. This also does take place during a pretty gruesome war, so there is a lot of battle going on throughout this. Little spoiler that will convince you to read this, he does crawl to her during a battle because he's trying to get to her. And that was, so good. We want men that crawl to us in the middle of a war zone. I do plan on audiobooking Ruthless Vows this year as well, so then I will have finished this. The last book that I have is going to be the Defy the Night trilogy. This is also a completed trilogy, and I think this series is really good for people who are interested in a more fantasy world, but are kind of scared of the fae and magic and all of those things that go into it. This book really is just set in a kingdom, and there's the elite, and then there's the people who are in the slums that are not elite, and there's a disease blight that's going around, and there's a cure that only the elite can afford. So it's kind of that dynamic in this book, but there is a plot twist in this book pretty early on that had me jaw dropped. I absolutely was obsessed with it, and the romance is so much fun. It's almost like a friends to enemies to lovers situation, kind of. It's really confusing, but it's so good. And let me tell you, the blurbs on the back of all the authors that are recommending this book, we have Stephanie Garber, we have Jennifer Leventrout, Cassandra Clare, Mary E. Pearson, the big authors are recommending this series, and it is so good and so worth it.